Greetings. Now we'll focus on Chapter 11, Political Crime and Terrorism. But what I'd like to bring your attention to is additional materials that you might be interested in taking a look at, and that is my YouTube videos on terrorism and my YouTube videos on genocide. And so if you want to take a look at those videos, please feel free to do so. I use those primarily in my criminal profiling course, and sometimes I also use the terrorism videos in my law and social control graduate level course. So if you've taken or are taking my criminal profiling course, first I thank you very much for taking 2 courses with me, and then I would also note that there is some overlap there with some of these areas, and you're going to find overlap between your classes. Of course, if you're studying a particular subject matter such as criminal justice. Interestingly enough, to use the definition, political crime, that your author provides, illegal acts that are designed to undermine an existing government and threaten its survival. So, of course, that seems to be quite logical, but then when you think about it, okay, illegal acts, okay, that's defined by law, that are designed to undermine an existing government. So you have to think, what exactly does that mean? Designed to undermine existing government and to threaten its survival. So that is somewhat of an ambiguous definition in those regards. As we'll see with many of these terms, there'll be some areas where we have pretty much agreement, and then there'll be some areas where we have much debate and disagreement over whether it's political crime or not. Some examples that are provided in your textbook would be election fraud, treason, espionage, state organized political crimes, and using torture. Within this realm falls terrorism, which is often discussed in the press. And again, looking at the definition, in your textbook, terrorism, first of all, is premeditated, so it's not a spontaneous event that occurs. In that sense, it's planned. It's also politically motivated. It has a political nature to it. A motivating factor happens to be related to the politics and changing the political system or government or rules and regulations. And it goes against non-combatant targets, basically civilians. So it's not military based in that sense. It's not a war where you have military of one country and military of another, or you have different militaries within a country fighting, for example, in a civil war. And it's done by subnational groups, and the intention is to influence an audience. So we know all that, but one of the features, of course, here is that there's some cases where, again, we have a lot of agreement, and then there's some cases where we have disagreement. And what might be a terrorist group defined by a government one day may change 2 or 3 years later. There's certainly been cases where groups that were defined as terrorist groups later became the official and accepted government of a country. And then you can see some of the more specific information about terror cells and insurgents and revolutionary fighters and the like. And so I think that's a good area to look at closely, and also to recognize that there's different types of terrorists. For example, right-wing political groups and left-wing political groups. Also those that commit eco-terrorism. And there's state-sponsored terrorism, cult-based terrorism, nationalist terrorism, and there are different authors and researchers that have different typologies, but they all tend to have some similar themes usually. The motivation of a terrorist is another section which I think is very important to look at in trying to explain, and you get, again, different viewpoints that The psychological view that terrorists have major mental disorders um, doesn't seem to materialize in the research. In fact, terrorist groups try not to recruit mentally unbalanced individuals, because that leads to a lot of problems with their planning and also the increased risk of being detected by governments and law enforcement. Another view looks at the group being alienated from economic opportunities. And the research kind of shows that many terrorist leaders are middle or upper class. And so we're not quite sure how that holds either. Some will focus on the sociological aspects and creating a belief system. And others will look at wanting to overthrow a particular government. And one of the problems that I see, and I don't want you to give the impression that I have any answers here, but that there's all these different views of terrorist groups, and I think what's important to recognize is that there's no one simple answer. Various explanations that have been proposed have been shown not to, be accurate. We hear them over and over and over again in the press and the media. The terrorist is mentally ill doesn't seem to hold. Terrorists may become alienated. Terrorists certainly may be socialized into the terrorist life. And often there may be some economic factors, and there may be many political factors. Excuse me one moment while I grab a book that I'm reading right now. Let me see if I can get that there. And this is a book by Robert Pape and James Feldman called it's called Cutting the Fuse, The Explosion of Global Suicide Terrorism and How to Stop It. This is just a fascinating book. And I really, in a brief video, I can't go over all this in detail, but I would say if you want, Google Robert Pape, and he is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and also wrote the book Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide, Terrorism, and Bombing to Win. And also Bombing to Win, Air Power and Coercion in War. His book, Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism is also an excellent book. But he has some articles online. You can find his website, and I would recommend reading one of his articles if you wanted to pursue this in more detail, because he has, I think, some very fascinating explanations, but he provides support. And so my recommendation here is to just be cautious with the information that you hear in the media and who you get that information from. I hear so much erroneous information just from people in general and the media that it's very unfortunate. So again, stick with the research, look for the data. You remember the saying from the famous movie, show me the data, show me the research findings. And that holds true here, especially in when there's very important policy implications. And this wraps up this video.